in the English language. Hey, can you please tell me your full name now, your name at birth, your birth date, and where you were born?
I was born on April the 12th, 1936 in Minzivian in Azerbaijan. At the time of my birth, my family adopted the name Ibn Yaakov, so my name was Mikhail Ibn Yaakov. The name that I use now is Michael Jacobs, as you know.
Michael, tell me a little bit about your early life.
My family, living in Azerbaijan, had been there for many centuries, probably. They were a rabbinical family. They had been in Bukhara, in Samarkand, Astrakhan, and eventually Baku, which is in what is today now Azerbaijan. In the early 1930s, my grandfather and mother decided that because of the pressure from the then expanding USSR in that particular area, in their attempts to gain a warm water port, decided that they would go to America. They set off, my grandparents with their eldest son and their daughter, and eventually found their way as far as Holland. At some point subsequent to their arrival in Holland, they managed to get across the English Channel to England. And by about 1937, they were fairly well established. My grandfather working in his actual profession, which was a fur dealer, and started to establish part of the other family business, which was dealing in gemstones. At this point, he felt confident, I suppose, enough to send for the rest of the family, which was his second son, my father, whose name was Cyril, Hanania in Hebrew, and said, "Come." And we packed our bags. I, at the time, being an infant, had very little to do with this. I know from family stories that we used camels, we used donkeys, we used horses and carts, and we made our way across part of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. We exited from Armenia from Tiflis through Kars in the east of Turkey, and eventually arrived in western Turkey, in Istanbul, which is about the period from which I have consecutive memory. I can place the date very accurately on this because I recall sitting on what was probably a disused army blanket with my parents and a number of other people, perhaps a dozen other people, and a bunch of children. And we were sitting around listening to a radio, a crystal set, and there was one person who could understand what was being said, and they were doing the translating, and what this was the declaration of war with the Axis powers by the British. So this would place this in about September of 1939. I recall that there was a lot of discussion, a lot of arguments, being Jewish, and they decided collectively that the best thing to do was simply to keep going, because, as I recall several people saying, whatever the Europeans are doing has got nothing to do with us. We are going to America. And so we continued on our way from Istanbul across Bulgaria, the former Yugoslavia, and eventually arrived at the border of Yugoslavia and Italy, where the family took, and the people that accompanied them, took what you would call, I guess, a brownstone house in a street of houses in Trieste.
Michael, I wanted to ask you, going back to this other memory, listening to the radio, do you remember about how many people your family was traveling with? Any visuals that you can recall?
We have to remember that I was a very small child at the time. I was 4 going on 5 at this, by the time this trek ended. It seemed like a lot of large people and a lot of small people and many animals. I would, in retrospect, take a wild guess at perhaps 20 adults and maybe half a dozen children. This is an educated guess.
And do you remember at all during that time of traveling where the family would stay on their trek?
We stayed in places, you can still see them actually. If you travel in Turkey, probably still in Bulgaria, there are what once upon a time were called caravanseries, which are a version of what today you would call a youth hostel. And basically what they were fairly large 1- or 2-storied structures which were used by travelers. And they were all over the Middle East and all over Europe, up until perhaps the late 1930s, when you got the French pension concept, which made the larger structures, which these were basically, they were usually built around an open courtyard in the centre. And I've subsequently visited a number of these places, and although they seemed big and noisy back then, in retrospect, when one goes and visits these places, they tend to be a lot smaller than one's memory.
Now, we talked in our pre-interview about, I think it was a beach, you said you remembered?
Yes, this is when we arrived in Istanbul. We also tended to just camp out, as you would say it today. We had tent-like structures, in as much as, I guess the simplest way is if you think about a smaller version of a Bedouin tent that you might see in Israel today, where you have a number of vertical posts, perhaps 3 feet high, and you put one piece of material around it, thus creating a wall. This is the normal way of doing it. And if it was necessary to put some kind of a roof over the top of it, I mean, you use whatever there happens to be when you're in that kind of situation. Maybe some corrugated iron, there's usually lots of that lying around in places like that.
So what do you
Sheets.
remember from this place in Istanbul?
Endless traveling, endless walking, endless being bumped up and down on the backs of donkeys, It was very smelly most of the time. It was mostly very noisy, people noisy, not noisy from mechanical things. Constant arguing with local residents as to whether we would be allowed to continue. That again is with the ability to look back from this point of view that I know that that was so, because Ataturk had only taken over Turkey and kicked out the Beys a few years before this, 14 years before, 1926, not 14 years even.
Let me talk for
The beach you mentioned, by the way, was outside the walls of Istanbul. This is outside of the Galata Gate. It's a place where even today you will find transient peoples tend to hang out because it's easy to find stuff and acquire stuff at a reasonable cost, that is, vegetables or bread, clothing, whatever you need.
Let's talk for a minute about your parents. You told me your father's name. If you can repeat your father's name and tell us your mother's name.
My father's name in Hebrew was either Hanin or Hanania, depending upon how you wanted to pronounce it. My mother's name is Miriam. Because of the time that he was born, he was also given a Russian name, a Russian-sounding name anyway, Cyril. And my mother had adopted or was given a European-sounding name, which was Margaret or Margaret. I have no idea how she pronounced it.
Let me ask you, what memories do you have of your parents?
Almost none, to tell the truth, as individuals, because for the first 5 years in my life, I was traveling, as we've just discussed, with a group of adults and other children. And I guess one could say it was kind of a kibbutz atmosphere, in as much as the adults all looked alike, large, if they were male, large and with big beards, fur hats and baggy pants. And the women also looked all alike. They all seemed to have very dark, piercing eyes, long black hair, and they tended to wear baggy pants as well.
Tell me about now. Continue your story when your family arrived in Trieste.
By the time we arrived in Trieste, which was in the winter of 1940, a year after the Second World War had started, I'm speaking in an educative fashion now, subsequent education. They clearly had strong doubts about the wisdom of having continued on from Istanbul. And here they were in the middle of a war zone, because this particular area was a very confrontational area. And at that point, they decided the best thing to do was to really sit down in a proper structure, that is, a house, and regroup, which, as subsequent events proved, was their second major mistake. But referring back to your previous question, and I've had a moment or two to think about it a little more, it's really true that all the adults looked alike. They were large, always arguing in many languages. And this is my real, there were many parents, in other words.
What language were you speaking at that age?
At that particular time, principally Arabic and Hebrew, because that was the, Arabic was the lingua franca that my grandparents used. And my grandfather spoke fluent Hebrew, and so did my grandmother, and so did several of the other people, now I'm thinking about it. So I was educated very early in both of those languages, and by the time we got as far as or to the west end of Turkey, I suppose I could speak a sort of pidgin Turkish as well. And with subsequent events, I eventually picked up assorted other languages, which I dare say we'll go into in a moment.
Now, you said you remembered everybody being dark-eyed, dark-haired. Do you remember what your parents looked like at all? You're very light.
I know the reasons for this, this is an interesting question, because my grandfather, his family were all very dark. They all had crinkly hair, they all had natural curls, which we all, male members who survived, spent all their lives trying to straighten out. My grandmother's side of the family all had bright red hair, which is very common in Central Asia in certain communities. There's also a red-haired, blue-eyed group of people who really were very dominant in in Baghdad, where that's the Sassoon family. They had men. They really also had very red hair. Now, who knows where this came from? We can blame the Greeks, perhaps, or someone like that. Alexander, maybe.
Did you have any memory of what your parents looked like?
Not really, no. I have a memory which may or may not be true. I have a thought, if you will, rather than a memory, that my mother had grey eyes. But I'm not really sure. Both of her parents, who I met after the Second World War, both had dark eyes, and they were both dark. Well, they were pale skinned, but they had dark hair and dark eyes.
Let's go back again now to
Okay.
Trieste.
I suppose we must have been in this house for several weeks. I can only speculate that they were trying to contact people, probably my grandparents. But this was undoubtedly an impossible thing to do, because there was the whole of, as they say, war-torn Europe in between them and where my grandparents were by then, which of course my particular group had no idea that they had made it to anywhere in particular. All they knew was that someone had said, come. I remember that we weren't allowed to go out on the street because it was dangerous. There were, as we hear now, a lot of aircraft flying around, military aircraft. There were bombing raids. They were kind of sporadic. The house, I think I should give you a little bit of an explanation here. I've seen in Philadelphia and New York similar houses. If you've been in European cities, they're very common. They're red brick, fairly narrow, one room and a hallway wide, and about 4 or 5 stories high, in long rows, long boring rows with slate roofs. And very often, at the rear of the house, there are half floors. And I was put in a very small room, perhaps the size of a large carpet, with a single bed in it, which was in one of these half floors. I remember this very clearly because I remember how I used to have to go up the stairs in order to get to it. And the next floor up was also a half floor immediately over the top of the room that I was in. This was a bathroom. Bathrooms then had very large iron baths standing in them. And because of this, I'm still here today. Because at the time when the final bombing raid that struck us, it must have been probably the middle of the night. It's very difficult for me to judge. I know that it was nighttime. These things always seem to happen at night, I guess. And I was asleep in bed. And all of a sudden the world exploded. Very simple. I had no idea what had happened. I was too young. This, placing it in time, is late winter, early spring, perhaps, well, late winter, let's put it that way, of 1940, or early 1941. December, January, February, I know it was really cold. The world exploded, and there was a lot of noise, lots and lots of noise. And all of a sudden, after falling, I'm trying to put words on something which is really sort of a long time ago and difficult to explain because it was noise, smell, all of these things, and what's going on, what's happening. This is what's in one's mind, I suppose. And I found myself trapped in a very dark place, not understanding what it was at that particular time. And there was a lot of rubble underneath me. I was partly embedded in it. And I managed to wriggle free because I was small and could. But I was in what felt, I wouldn't have used such a word in those days, but it felt like I was inside a coffin. And I was banging up against it with stones and screaming, shouting, whatever, for however long. I have no idea how long. Perhaps an hour, perhaps 2 hours. I have no idea. But the end of that particular thing was suddenly seeing a long piece of light suddenly appear and a bunch of fingers appear under the edge of what then became apparent. It was I'd been trapped by the bath. The bath, when the house exploded, must have flipped and encased me. And there were, after bombing raids, air raids. I guess in most European countries, what I now know were called air raid wardens or something like that, who were usually very old people who wore trench coats and tin helmets and went around the blown up houses looking to see if there were any survivors. And they lifted the bath up because they must have heard me screaming inside, and they lifted the whole thing up, and all I could see was torches, lights, shining at me. And I saw what really seemed to be two really ugly old people who were probably very nice people, otherwise they wouldn't have been doing what they were doing. And I ran.
Did you have any understanding of what happened, that there was a war going on?
Well, yes, this I understood. I was going on 6 years old. I had a very clear idea of this because I had spent the last several years listening to everybody discussing what to do next because of this. Do we continue? Do we not continue? I ran, but I probably didn't run very far because I just hid in some wreckage. And when it became light, I suddenly just felt totally exposed. I was a small child, and yes, I was used to roughing it, but on the other hand, where were all the grown-ups?
Did you attempt to
And
go back?
I was wandering around, and I was really in a daze, I guess. And I saw a couple of other kids, and they came over to me and they talked to me. I didn't understand what they were saying, but they dragged me along anyway. And I knew where the house was, but it had all changed.
Okay, Michael, we're going to have to stop and change to the next tape.
Okay.
Bake-offs. Michael, I want to go on and continue to talk about what happened when you went back to the building. And then I want to go back and talk about another area for a minute. So let's continue with what we were talking about at the end of the first tape.
That is myself and these other couple of kids, although they were both larger than me, I sort of dragged them in the direction where the house was. And when we got there, there were several completely destroyed houses and a lot of people with carts. And we stood there and we watched them, and they were loading body parts and bodies and all sorts of other unpleasant things into carts, hand carts. These were the kind of carts, which I grew very familiar with over the next few years. In England, they would call them barrows. They were like a stretcher in a way, with two large wheels in the middle, and they could be pushed. We kept fairly far back so that we wouldn't be spotted. I didn't want to be spotted by anyone. These two kids also didn't want to be spotted by anyone. And
Do you remember what was going through your head at the time?
all I can remember really about it because there were so many disturbances. I would like to be able to create a picture, but it's a difficult thing to do. It was a question that you addressed at the pre-interview, actually, which was about the memory of the whole wartime experience. The most prominent thing is the noise in my memory. And the second most prominent thing is the terrible smells everywhere, all the time, 24 hours a day. So this was probably about the first time that I really realized how noisy it was. But a lot of this could easily have been noise simply in my head. And we were watching all of these bodies and body parts being loaded into a bunch of these carts and being taken off, covered up in canvas.
Were these all people that you knew?
There weren't large enough bits really left. There were a few bodies there. Yes, there were several people that I recognized as being part of. I mean, the house didn't exist. I mean, it was completely destroyed. I was frightened. I was scared. I was a scared, very scared little boy. There wasn't a great deal of thought attached to anything. This is, I suppose, now you're questioning in this way. There was really not. It's just a feel. It was all feeling. It was all emotion. What's going to happen? Am I going to go someplace too, like they have, all in little bits and get blown up? Just raw fear, really. This is the only real answer I can give. And after probably only a few minutes of looking, these two kids took me and dragged me away from the entire area, and we went to a ramshackle building where we then sort of settled down, and over the period of perhaps an hour there were half a dozen other children who joined. And these are kids who were of all shapes and sizes. There were a couple of kids who were younger than me. Well, at any rate, they were smaller than me. There were some larger children, perhaps 10, 11, 12 years old. I obviously can't be very accurate about this. There were a total of perhaps 10 or 12 kids altogether, of both sexes. There were girls and boys. When I say kids, I'm being unisexual. Although everybody was about equally dirty and everybody was about equally ragged, even at that early point in the war. And I guess everybody was pretty thin as well. These children who I fell in with were from all sorts of ethnicity, if you will. I'm not quite sure what the correct terminology would be to use. There were certainly Italians, there were also French-speaking kids, and there were also German-speaking kids. And there was no really established pecking order or dominance by any particular sex or age or anything. over the next several weeks, the larger of the two boys who had got hold of me in the first place, he was killed. He got in the way of a bullet or whatever.
Did you see this?
Yeah, all the time.
But was this your first experience?
No, you're jumping the gun there. And for a while, the chief person, if you will, was a girl who was probably maybe 11, perhaps 12 years old. I eventually discovered that once you got to be that big, you became a much more obvious target, which is why the larger kids seem to disappear with monotonous regularity. They were either co-opted by local people as sort of slaves, or worse, whatever.
Did you try to establish any kind of close relationship with any one of these other children?
No, this was not the nature of this kind of thing at all. It's really, I don't think there's really anything in contemporary experience except for perhaps maybe East LA during the riots. That would be a good example. Lots of kids running around completely out of control because all the grown-ups are out of control. I mean, perhaps the motivation is different, but the net result is large numbers of small children with no proper role models and no discipline trying to stay alive. And I really perceive that there is a great deal of similarity with the experience of some of these young people in Los Angeles and what we experienced at the beginning of the Second World War as children.
Michael, how were you able to communicate with these other children?
This is, again, a very interesting question because this is something that I've discussed with my wife and other people over the years, that we all were always taught how to read by the oldest children. Not any particular language, but we were taught to read what was written on the box or the can or the container so that we knew what was in it, such that we wouldn't waste our time or energy on opening up cases or cans or whatever for motor oil, which you can't eat or drink. So we learned how to read. There was no real lingua franca. Everybody, all of the kids, we learned to communicate basically, I guess, in pidgin French. It was almost like a kid's language, which contained elements of numerous European languages because we came from such widely different backgrounds.
Did any of the other children at any point speak Hebrew, or were any of the other children Jewish? Did you ever find out?
I, over the next several years, met and was together with several Jewish children, but this was fortuitous. It was by chance. It was not through planning. We were kids with no place to go and nothing to do and nothing to eat, and all we were really concerned with was not each other's religious background or ethnic background. It was just mutual support for staying alive. This was really the only thing. Keep out of the way of anyone larger than you. any adult we viewed as being circumspect, if you will.
Now, I want to back up for a second in dealing with being Jewish. You came from a family of rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
What memories do you have of being Jewish before this event happened? How religious was your family?
Oh, throughout the travels. How interesting. What an interesting question. Yeah, throughout our travels, the women always used to light candles on Shabbat. This was something that they used to go to enormous lengths to be able to do. I mean, I can see in my mind's eye, so to speak, you know, sort of situations where we're sitting around a campfire perhaps, or in some town somewhere in a room, and one or more of the women making a bracha over the candles on Shabbat. But that was about the extent, because those of us who were traveling across Turkey, who finally arrived there, we were all Jewish. This was for sure. We were all Jewish. This I knew. There was no question about that, because they were either family, extended family, or close friends of family. And nobody made any big issue about it. This is sort of, you know, okay, you're Jewish, so what?
But were you aware of what was going on during World War II
No.
with the Jews?
Absolutely not.
At any point after?
Oh yes,
I mean, after your
early-
parents were killed.
perhaps much later on, in late 1944, perhaps early 1945, when I was 10 years old, I certainly had a very clear understanding by that time that it wasn't a cool thing to advertise the fact that you were Jewish. Now, that information was not, if you will, disseminated by anyone who was educating me or anyone else not to be Jewish. This was, Michael, it's not a good idea if you tell people you're Jewish. Why? Well, we heard that all the Jews are being shot, blown up, shipped off, whatever words we heard at that particular time, over a period of time. This was not a sudden incident. One acquired information about such things very slowly. For example, we learned early on that we had to make our way north because it would be much easier for us to make it in France. And none of us were great geographers. We were kids, remembering this. France was over the hill, in the same way that America was over the hill, or whatever. Germany was over the hill, but we didn't want to go over that hill because we heard bad things about the Germans.
What did you hear?
Well, we heard that the Germans and the British and the French and the Italians were not cool people because they were the ones that were behind all the blowings up and all the shootings and all of those things. There was no question of the good against the bad, them against the Jews, the West against the East. None of these things were concerned. It was grown-ups, in particular grown-ups from those countries were the people that were making all this noise and all this smell and killing all these people. And they would kill us if they got hold of us. They were all circumspect. They were all suspect. in particular the ones in uniform, and it didn't matter what kind of uniform it was. And I probably went off sideways there, but whatever. It's a very difficult question to address. There's something that you asked me several weeks ago about what about women? How did you deal? Did you get any, what was it you said to me?
My
Do you remember that
question
question?
was who was safe?
Oh yes, you asked me if women were safer than men or something like that.
Yeah.
I gave you a straight off the cuff answer to that, and having had several weeks to think about it, I won't change my answer. That we learned that women were in particularly dangerous, that we had to keep far away from any structure which had a woman in it, as well as other people like children or older people, because they turned us in numerous times. If we were trying to snitch milk from a doorstep or a loaf of bread or whatever, it was always women who turned us in. Men tended not to turn us in if they saw us, if they caught us. We would give them a pack of cigarettes because this was one of the ways that and that would shut them up. But mostly women were out to protect their families or whoever they had in their care, and they certainly didn't want a bunch of young ruffians like us who were kind of murderous and very violent, and not even from their neighborhood. Why would they be friendly toward us? Why? One asks. This is easy to ask in retrospect, of course, and it's easy to justify in retrospect, I suppose. Yes, first of all, you look after yourself and yours. This is one of the realities. We kept well clear of ladies.
What about elderly people?
Elderly people, by the end of 1943, after I'd been at this for a couple of years and I was older and stronger and probably more cynical about who was who, it was very interesting in retrospect to see that the population, such as it was, of Europe that was not involved in actually fighting was principally very young people or very old people. As I recall it, the older people were somewhat more stable in their groups, but they worked very much like we did. They worked together for mutual support, tried to keep out of the way, trying to make a place to be which didn't look like a place to be from the outside. I guess this is the key to it, that we chose always to hang out in places which looked as though they were destroyed completely. And generally what we did was and there were plenty of them all over Europe. I mean, there was much bombing, as you are aware. What we did, the older kids, as we got a bit older, was to hollow out spaces. I suppose I can make a comment of this type. In the Schindler's List movie, where you see these kids in the toilet, this was like high-class quarters. That would have been considered very high-class quarters and also very dangerous quarters. Inappropriate because it's too obvious. And I know for a fact that there were many older people and younger people who used places like this, and most of the time they were caught because it was too obvious. Understanding that those of us who made it and remained free right up to 1945, in order to do that, in order to remain free, we had to be excessively violent, and local people who were older, who were still in their houses, undoubtedly regarded us as being as much a threat to their existence as the Germans, the Italians, the French, the Germans, whoever.
Why were you a threat?
Well, we needed to eat. This is where you start looking at some of the sort of things that we would do. Our choice was always to steal stuff from freshly bombed houses or other structures. This was the preferred way of doing things because the people were probably all dead, and there was too much chaos going on for anyone to take any notice of maybe one or two children, small children. We would, the larger kids would find stuff where it was and would act as lookouts, if you will. The smaller children were sent in to do the job because they were smaller. Very simple. Medium-sized children, as I was, say from the age of 8 through to 10 or 11 medium-sized kids, we were always at the greatest risk because sometimes we would be sent to do something, we would choose to do something or get sent by whoever was playing leader at that particular moment to do jobs which we were not quite big enough for, or to do jobs which we might be too small, too big to do, either too big or too small. It was a difficult
What kinds of jobs would those be?
Well, getting through small spaces into bomb structures like houses. How can I give you an example? Okay, Northridge earthquake. You saw how some of those houses are pancaked, such that there were maybe 2 or 3 feet of space, which originally was 14 or 15 feet perhaps. All over Europe, houses were not built such that they would withstand earthquakes. And the effects of continuous bombing and shelling generated much of the same effects. If you look at any of the footage of cities that have been subjected to extensive bombing, the same effect. So you were small, and there were several reasons for using small children. There wasn't much time invested in teaching them anything, so therefore they were more expendable than older children if the thing collapsed on top of you. And also you were a smaller visible thing and able to get into smaller places. So this was on the one hand. This was the preferred way of going. The next most preferred way of acquiring stuff, principally food, was simply to steal it. Even at the height of the war, interestingly enough, in places like France and probably Belgium and Holland, there were still milkmen in the old-fashioned sense with a horse and cart who would deliver milk in those bottles and put them on the doorstep. and they often had some butter or some eggs, 1 or 2 eggs maybe, and they would leave them for their preferred customers. And we would set up, I don't know what the right word would be, not really an ambush, we would set ourselves up such that at the crack of dawn, which is when people like that did their job, that we could then snitch it before anyone opened the door to get it. And it was most successful, of course, if it was immediately after or during the latter part of an air raid. This made life a lot easier. Unfortunately, this kind of opportunism didn't get that much of a workout. So we come to the third level down, if you will, which was you see someone, we would spot someone, usually an older person, you know, over the age where they could possibly be drafted, or an older woman perhaps, with a shopping bag. We tended not to go for people who didn't have shopping bags or some obvious packages, and we would waylay them and do them in, take what they had and go. This is putting it kind of plainly and bluntly, but...
Did you mug them or did you kill them?
No, you killed them. This was a pre-requirement. 4 or 5, usually boys, because they were heavier, would jump the person, and 1 or perhaps 2 of us who were perhaps smaller than the ones that did the jumping would have an appropriate thing, a brick, a large piece of wood, and we would smash them to pieces. I mean, we learned that, you know, it's fairly easy to break a skull if you hit it hard enough. And if you do it enough times, you can pretty much guarantee that the person isn't going to get up again. And that was pretty much what we did all the way through to about the end of 1943.
Hey, Michael, we have to stop and change